introduce Igor. It's hard. He is an amazingly accomplished person. I'm honored to be sitting here. I asked him yesterday what he does. He told me he's in a stealth mode startup, and if he told me, he would have to kill me. You think it's a joke, but then I realized he got the Eisenhower and Truman National Security Fellowship to increase the collaboration with the intelligence community. And I'm like, things are not looking good for me as a minority right now. I know the session's been tough, the afternoon's rough. I wanted to be a stand-up comedian. You are my test audience. Igor and I are going to try and have some fun here. We're going to try and ask some interesting questions and try to get a sense of what's happening in the intelligence community. No, sorry, did I say that loud? Let's get started, Igor, if you don't mind. I think there is a lot of alt facts and fake news happening. What are you reading these days?
Actually, one of my favorite books is the Amazon book of the day, and that's Asimov's Foundation. So I remember first reading it as an elementary school student. I was, where was I? I was at a monastery during the summer with no electricity, and I remember reading this by candlelight. And it's always an odd cognitive dissonance, whatever, to be reading such forward-looking visions of where we would go in such a serene and just as old school as you can get place.
That is awesome. Selden was my hero in the sense that I always thought that if I learned more statistics, I could predict and avoid mule-type incidents from happening. Folks who have not read Foundation will not get this story. This is like a geek moment. You are founder of a startup, not your first one. You've done a couple of successful exits as well. You're an entrepreneur in residence at Blackstone and in Northern Carolina. What are you seeing being funded? Like when I look at the environment, I see a bunch of companies focused on building tools that allow people. I think Gaurav talked about democratization of AI. So there's a companies who are building tools, and then Phil before him talks about companies that are building applications. And there's a bunch of folks here who talked about applications. How do you see that mix happening? What is your view on where this is going?
I think you have plenty of examples where certain startups decide to build platforms thinking that's the path to riches, a la Salesforce and everything else, and yet we had that exit with Mint where the application was the one that took off, and then the one that was actually the financial services back end that did all of the heavy lifting, was 1/10 of the value of the application. And you'll constantly see those examples back and forth. I think you do have clustering around these different AI approaches and everything else. Frankly, and I don't mean to sound demeaning, I'm usually not interested in those open source or collective tools. And the reason why I'm not is because, frankly speaking, by having collections of startups around those things, on one hand, you would think that it reduces the cost and entry and there's shared knowledge that goes back and forth, but it also reduces genetic diversity. So we tend to, it doesn't matter that we worked on Alexa or Watson and everything else, we typically burn everything down and start from scratch every time. Because what's different? Every time you have a different set of semiconductors, you have a different set of tools, you have a different set of this, different set of that. In the next one, we're not using anything that's out there. Because everybody tries to sit up here and say, well, here's my predictions for the future and everything else, and well, how long is that going to take to happen? And everybody tries to give a guess, and usually says it is a guess. We don't like guessing. We just, it's that cliche line, you want to invent the future, right? In 2005, I'm sitting there, when I was leading the IBM speech team that was focused on the multimodal stuff, and it was absurd to use stupid remote controls to change the television channels. And so all the way in 2005, we knew that we just wanted to yell at these stupid things to have them change channels, because it's not that hard to compare your voice to one of 1,000 channels, potentially, and then everything else that was in there. That was like, not even a freshman, for God's sakes. An AP Comp Sci student can create a grammar for those things. And yet, how long does it take these companies 10 years later to create solutions like Fire TV?
And folks who don't know, Igor let the words first, let the development of the words first speech-enabled browser. I think that's what you were referring to. As an entrepreneur, this is primarily an entrepreneurship conference. What we see today is probably the fruits of labor of 2 or 3 years. So the stuff that we are seeing coming out today is probably because somebody started thinking about it 2 or 3 years ago, started building stuff and got it to a point where they're ready to show. If an entrepreneur wants to look at areas today, to the extent that you can predict or say, what areas do you feel are ripe for new innovation or explosion?
I tend to be a fan of a lot of the things that Apple does vis-a-vis cannibalizing itself. So you have to imagine a world where you throw out everything you've heard at this conference and go and do something completely different than what you've heard. I mean, it's one thing for them to say, look, we're selling a lot of these iPods and then we're going to throw them all out and develop this new platform. Frankly speaking, that's the challenge that I would take, because if you're thinking about growing $1 billion company, you honestly think all you're going to be doing is adding 1 or 2 extra little data things, or all right, well, we're going to take this and then send it to the bank and that's it. Yeah. That's fine, you know, for a normal distribution of curve of startups. But I would think that those of you that are trying to push certain boundaries, it's developing, you know, many things. The other thing, when professors, you know, talk about, well, a body of research is figuring out what's actually happening inside. In a way that's a little bit arrogant, in the same way, if one of you walked to the back and picked up a bag of potato chips or a chocolate chip cookie, I could argue that you know that it's not going to be healthy for you, and all sorts of decisions. And yet, for whatever reason, you still grab that cookie. But if I asked you why you took it, you wouldn't be able to justify your behavior to me, let alone to yourself. And yet we think that we can look inside of these machines and understand why they're doing the same thing.
Yeah, that's something that I'm unable to fathom, because I was having this discussion with Steve, who's going to do the closing keynote today, that the criteria for getting a driver's license in California is way easier than a self-driving car. And the number of accidents that Californian drivers cause are probably way more than the self-driving cars. We seem to have a different standard when it comes to quality or error-free nature of some of these things. Do you see that really more of a societal impact and just people getting used to the idea? Or do you think there is something deeper that will prevent such ideas from moving forward, maybe?
I think it's a generational thing. Most of the people in the audience, it doesn't matter that my Tesla can self-drive. I'm never going to have my Tesla self-driving because I like being in the pilot seat, right? I think it's a generational thing. There's a reason why most of us don't post, you know, every, you know, bowl of Cheerios that we consume every morning, right? They love sharing and oversharing, and that's just a different style in society that they have with their Finstas and their real Rinstas and all this, you know, crazy slang that you can't even keep up to date, right?
Maybe we should have a quick poll. So how many people are guilty here of posting a picture of their food before they eat it? Just a quick show of hands.
It's not that many.
Not that many. Okay, so
every 12-year-old does it. Everything they do. But that's okay. I mean, they're more comfortable. They're going to have a different culture than we have, and our culture is different from our parents and our grandparents and everything else. It's just natural where they're not going to own cars and they'll have all of these other things. I think though, even if you compare apples to apples in the Nordics, right, in places where they do have strong public transportation, it is very difficult to actually get a driver's license, and an average citizen is a lot more capable there. It's also the difference, I don't know if you're familiar with the avionics of a Boeing versus an Airbus. The way Boeing typically constructs their systems is that they assume that if the pilot says go left, the plane immediately turns left, because they assume the pilot is an expert in any particular situation. Airbus does something completely different. They assume that most pilots are average. These aren't sullies. They're just normal people with X number of hours and everything else. If you bank hard left beyond the 15 degrees that you're typically allowed to, it's not going to do it. It's going to second guess the pilot and say, is it reasonable for you to go, and what are all the sensors telling me, and what are the machines telling me if you're banking hard left? And so stylistically, there's just different things that you'll have vis-a-vis your own user base, right? Is the human the expert, or is the human just yet another average, human that's operating a vehicle or something else that you need to babysit?
Yeah. So in light of that, I'm always reminded of the Gartner hype cycle, where there is always this peak of inflated expectations before the trough of disillusionment. Given your perspective of what you see, do you feel, because I do certainly feel that there is a little bit of inflated expectations on what can happen, but then I probably don't have as wide a view as yours, so I'll be interested in hearing your view.
Well, I think, again, many of us worked on cloud before people and tech journalists knew how to label it as cloud, right? And all this AI stuff and everything else. Before Web 2.0, people were doing it, and then they start. So it's almost, once it's labeled, it's already too late. And also, it's a misnomer, right? So it's a little challenging to talk about that when, in fact, most of us would realistically say, well, what do we think of AI? It's more the way that the mass market thinks about it. It's an entity that's self-aware, that's able to even make decisions with contradictory inputs, like that chocolate chip cookie, right? Yeah. And that's something that we're not even close to doing. Now, on the flip side, I have to say, I'm not fearful of it. A lot of people are afraid, oh my God, what is it going to do? And one thing, when you adopt these types of technologies, we've had tremendous changes in the past with industrialization and the information age, and humans always adapted. You know how I know we adapt? Because the majority of us in the audience have jobs that didn't even exist in the past, right? So why do we have a sense of arrogance presuming that our children and grandchildren are going to want your jobs and my job? They don't. They'll have something else that doesn't even exist. There was no social media, whatever, 10, 20 years ago as a job, and it may not even exist in the future, and that's okay. They'll make other types of jobs with a new set of tools. Another thing, vis-a-vis being fearful of AI, it's total BS. I don't know why this all started as a meme. It's like being afraid of your own children. Input equals output. Whatever you use to train these things is what they'll do. If you train a little Terminator, don't be surprised if it comes after you. I mean, it's, I don't understand, it's like, oh my God, the toaster is trying to burn me.
I think the analogy you're trying to give is your children if you give them a knife, then the results are more or less the same.
Knives.
In my case, if I give my children a pair of scissors, then everything is cut off.
Okay, here's what's funny. Our children can't even understand no running signs by swimming pools. Yeah. And yet we assume that we have a golden disk and we can communicate with ET out there, on the Voyager spacecraft. I mean, we have to kind of look a little bit inward, when we're thinking about these second order effects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something to think about. There was a discussion yesterday I was having with a few folks on learning biases through data. And speaking of data, I think one thought that comes to my mind is a lot of these deep learning startups and the fact that you need a fair amount of data to train a deep learning model. So as a startup, probably data is the thing that's most scarce for you. Do you think that prevents and creates a situation where innovation is a little stifled, and the bigger companies, instead of earlier the corporate muscle was you had lots of money and you had lots of people, do you see that changing into big companies like Google or Tesla and Facebook or Uber having lots of data, and that prevents startups from coming up? I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think so, because it's startups that originally discovered that data was useful in the first place, like Waze, right? It's like when I did the speech reco, cloud-based speech reco, everybody's like, aren't you afraid of IBM and Google? I'm like, why? Why would I be? They're not gathering this data. In fact, they used to license some of the stuff that I used to build at IBM, and so I know exactly what they could get. right? So no, I think that's how everything adapts itself. I mean, startups are, if you look at the R&D budget of most of these large companies, it keeps getting constrained, right? Startups are outsourced R&D essentially. And so once they discover interesting platforms or applications, they get acquired. This is the natural cycle of it. And what's interesting is you have a whole ecosystem here that's built on these exits, M&A and whatnot, and IPOs. Why would you be scaring people from being entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs creating these things when it's the very nature of the cycle here?
Yeah. There's an interesting thing about taking data, applying machine learning on it, or deep learning, or whatever your favorite flavor is. And one of the things that you get out is a model. In a way, a model is a distillation of that data. So you can say, I've converted data into information. Do you see a space for an iTunes-like model store coming up where people could sell and license models themselves for other folks?
It could be, but I have to tell you, in reality, whatever you think you're getting out there as open source platforms and open source models and everything else, nobody's ever going to hand you their golden goose and golden eggs. So even to bootstrap speech engines, UPenn had a library of speech data, and everybody originally started with that. Whether you're IBM or whether you're Microsoft, whether you're Google, everybody licensed this package and got started with that. But guess what you did beyond that? Everything you can get independently, you put into that. I know for our engines, we had 49 million unique American voices. Many of you out in the audience, voices may have already been trapped by that system. It was just an organic part of having that thing live in the carrier operator land. But guess what we couldn't do? We could never share that data with any other partners. We couldn't market against that data. It literally was for our own model building, and you can be damn sure we never were going to open source that for everybody else to use.
And the final question, which I think everybody is trying to hear your perspective on, because we are running out of time, so very quickly, when is the Singularity coming again?
He knew I was going to get a laugh.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks again.